In the Regency era, when a rich woman wanted a husband, she had everything laid out for her like a table set for a feast. Her family gave her a large dowry, which was a pile of money and land meant to tempt a good gentleman. She went to balls in silk dresses, danced with officers and lords, and let her mother whisper about eligible bachelors over tea. She had chaperones, matchmaking aunts, and fancy carriages to carry her from one party to the next. All she really had to do was smile, play the pianoforte a little, and wait for a man with a title to notice her from across the ballroom. But now, what did a poor woman do? She had no dowry, no silk dress, no ballroom, no carriage, and certainly no aunt with connections to a lord. For her, finding a husband was not a game of hearts and flowers, it was a desperate hunt for survival, and she had to play it on a completely different field. A poor woman in the Regency era faced a life that was harsh and unforgiving. Unlike the rich ladies who worried about which ribbon matched their gown, a poor woman worried about whether she would eat tomorrow. She had no inheritance waiting for her because families with little money gave everything to the eldest son. Daughters were seen as extra mouths to feed, and once a father died, the small cottage or rented room often passed to a brother or a landlord. That meant a young woman had to leave home early, usually as a maid, a farm laborer, a washerwoman, or a factory girl. She worked from dawn until late at night for pennies, and those pennies barely bought bread and a place to sleep. Sickness was a disaster. A bad cough meant losing a job. A lost job meant the street. There were no hospitals for the poor, no government help, no charity that lasted more than a meal. Marriage was not about love or romance for such a woman. It was survival. A husband meant a second pair of hands, a shared rent, and a little more safety from the world. But here is the hard truth. Poor women did not attend glittering balls. They did not have a dowry to offer. They could not hire a matchmaker or wait for a wealthy gentleman to notice them from a carriage window. The rich married for land and money. The poor married for practical reasons, and finding a husband required a completely different set of skills. A poor woman could not sit at home and wait. She had to be clever, visible, and useful. She had to understand that in her world, marriage was a deal made in kitchens, at market stalls, on church steps, and in the shared courtyards of crowded tenements. She needed to prove that she was not a burden, but a benefit. And that meant mastering the few tools she had: her reputation, her work, her health, and her sharp understanding of human need. So let us walk through the real ways a poor Regency woman found a husband, without fine dresses or fancy parties, but with nothing but her wits and her will. A poor woman in the Regency era had no ballroom to show herself off, but she had something almost as useful: her work. Work was not just how she stayed alive, it was also the main place where she could meet a future husband. Unlike rich ladies who sat at home embroidering, a poor woman was out in the world every single day. She walked to the market, cleaned other people's houses, sewed in a crowded workshop, or served food in a tavern. And in those places, men were present, working men. Men who also needed a wife for practical reasons, not for love poems. Take the servant girl, for example. She might work as a maid in a large house, scrubbing floors and carrying coal. In that house, she would meet the footmen, the coachman, the gardener, and the stable hand. These men earned small wages but had a steady place to sleep and a bit of food. For a poor woman, a footman with a reliable job was a fine catch. They would talk in the kitchen while peeling potatoes or pass each other in the narrow servants' hallway. Over time, a friendship grew, and if both were sensible, they would agree to marry. It was not a grand romance. It was two tired people deciding that two wages were better than one, and that sharing a small room meant sharing the rent. Then there was the governess. She lived in a strange, sad middle place. She was too educated to marry a laborer, but too poor to marry a gentleman. Still, her work put her in contact with the men of the house: the master, the tutor, the visiting clergyman, or the local doctor's son. These were not rich lords, but they were men with a small income and a need for a quiet, respectable wife. A governess had to be careful, because a bad reputation meant losing her job. But if she was polite, neat, and useful, she might catch the eye of a man who valued sense over beauty. She offered him a well-trained mind and good manners, and he offered her a roof that was not borrowed. Seamstresses and milliners worked in small shops or in their own tiny rooms. They spent their days bent over needles and fabric, but they also delivered finished work to customers. Those customers included shopkeepers, clerks, and tradesmen. A young woman who sewed quickly and neatly might catch the attention of a widowed tailor who needed help in his business, or a merchant who wanted a wife who could mend his shirts and save him money. In the crowded workrooms, seamstresses also talked to the delivery boys, the paper boys, and the men who brought cloth from the docks. A kind word and a shared crust of bread could lead to a wedding within a year. Market sellers had an even easier time. A woman selling eggs, bread, or old clothes from a stall saw hundreds of people every week. She learned who was honest, who worked hard, and who was looking for a wife. The butcher's son might stop by every morning. The farmer bringing vegetables might linger at her stall. These men saw that she was strong, sharp with numbers, and not afraid of hard work. For a poor working man, a wife who could haggle at market and count pennies was worth more than any pretty face. He did not want a delicate flower. He wanted a partner who would not faint at the sight of a dirty floor. Even women who worked in factories or as washerwomen had their chances. They met men at the pump while fetching water, at the church on Sunday, or at the pub where they went to warm their hands. The key was visibility. A poor woman who stayed hidden in her room would never find a husband. She had to be seen as capable, clean, and cheerful enough to work beside. Romance was secondary. What mattered was this: could she cook? Could she sew? Could she bear children and still carry a bucket of water? Those were the questions men asked themselves, and clever, poor women knew that showing off their work skills was the same as showing off their worth as a wife. They did not have a dowry of gold, but they had a dowry of strong hands and a willing back, and in the hard world of the Regency poor, that was often enough. But work was not the only place where a poor woman could find a husband. The local community itself worked like a slow, steady matchmaker. In the Regency era, poor people lived packed together in small villages or crowded city neighborhoods. Everyone knew everyone, and while that could be a curse if you made a mistake, it could also be a blessing if you wanted to find a husband. Churches, markets, festivals, and village gatherings were all free to attend, and in those everyday spaces, marriages were quietly made. Take the church on a Sunday. Almost everyone went, even the poorest families. After the service, people stood outside in the churchyard and talked. They talked about the weather and about who was sick, but they also looked. A young woman would notice which young man stood quietly with his family. A mother would whisper about her hard-working son. The church was neutral ground, not a tavern where a woman's reputation could be ruined. It was a place where a poor woman could be seen as decent and honest. For many men, a godly wife was a safe choice. Markets were another powerful meeting ground, especially on Saturdays. The market was loud and crowded. Women walked from stall to stall. Men came too, farmers, butchers, and laborers. In that crowd, faces became familiar. A woman who sold eggs every week would see the same men. Over time, nods turned into words turned into jokes, and a joke might turn into an offer to walk her home. It was slow, but it worked. Everyone knew that a woman who handled herself well at market could run a household. Festivals and fairs were rarer, but more exciting. These were the holidays of the poor: May Day, Harvest Home, the village fair. Young people were given more freedom on these days. They danced on the grass and shared a jug of cider. A poor woman could meet a man from a neighboring village, someone who did not know her family's troubles. Many marriages started with a dance at a fair. It was not proper by the standards of the rich, but the poor made their own rules. Word of mouth was the strongest tool of all. In a poor community, everyone talked. If a young woman was known to be hardworking and even-tempered, that news spread fast. A widow looking for a wife for her son would ask her neighbors. A farmer whose wife had died would tell the parson he needed help. The woman herself did not always have to search. Sometimes a husband came looking for her because her reputation had walked ahead of her. That is why poor women guarded their good name so fiercely. One rumor of laziness or a hint of being too friendly with a married man could ruin everything. None of this was glamorous. There were no glass slippers. A poor woman found a husband not by waiting for a prince, but by showing up week after week at church and market and fair. She built a name for herself as someone reliable and strong. And in the crowded, messy world of the Regency poor, that name was the only fortune she would ever need. But even when a poor woman met a possible husband at church or market, the match was rarely about love at first sight. For her, marriage was a practical deal, not a fairy tale. She did not look for a handsome face or a charming smile. She looked for steady hands, a regular wage, and a man who did not drink away his pay. Love could grow later, or it might never come at all. That was fine. What mattered was surviving the winter. A poor woman chose her husband the way she chose a good cooking pot, carefully, with an eye for what would last. She asked around about him. Did he show up to work every day? Did he have a trade like carpentry or blacksmithing? Was he known to be gentle, or did he have a quick fist? A man who worked as a laborer on a farm might earn little, but he got a cottage to live in and sometimes a bit of extra food. A soldier offered a uniform and a small but steady pay from the army, though he might be sent away to fight. A sailor could bring back good money from long voyages, but a poor woman had to be brave enough to raise children alone for months at a time. Tradesmen like bakers, butchers, and shoemakers were prized husbands because they worked in one place and their skills were always needed. The deal was simple. The man brought in money or food, the woman brought cooking, cleaning, sewing, and childbearing. Together, they could afford a small room instead of a shared bed in a crowded house. Together, they could save a few pennies for hard times. If she was lucky, her husband would teach her his trade, so she could keep working after they married. If he was lucky, she would stretch his wages so far that they never went to bed hungry. Neither of them expected roses or poetry. They expected a full belly and a dry place to sleep. That was their version of a happy ending. And so, in the end, the greatest difference between a rich woman and a poor woman in the Regency era was not their dresses or their houses, it was what marriage meant to each of them. For a rich woman, marriage was about keeping land in the family, adding to her father's power, or climbing a little higher on the social ladder. She could afford to wait for love, or at least for a man she did not completely hate. Her parents might let her refuse one or two suitors. She had a roof over her head no matter what. But for a poor woman, marriage was about staying alive. She could not wait for love. She could not refuse a decent man just because he had bad teeth or told boring stories. If she turned down a steady worker, another woman would say yes, and that other woman would eat warm bread while she went hungry. Love was a rare and beautiful thing, and it did sometimes happen. A poor couple might grow to care for each other deeply after years of sharing hard work and hard times. But love was rarely the starting point. It was a prize that came later, if the couple was very lucky. Survival was the first goal. A husband meant someone to split the rent with, someone to carry water when she was heavy with child, someone to argue with the landlord or fight off a thief. And for the man, a wife meant hot meals, mended shirts, and someone to watch the babies while he worked. It was a trade, a fair trade. In a world that gave poor women almost nothing, marriage was still one of the few doors left open. It was not a door to a ballroom. It was a door to another day of work, another loaf of bread, another winter survived. And for a woman who had nothing else, that door was everything. So, that is how the lower-class women of that time found husbands. No balls, no dowries, no princes in disguise. Just hard work, smart choices, and a good name carried like a shield. The poor women of the Regency era did not find husbands by chance. They found them by being useful, visible, and tough as old leather. That was their love story, even if no one wrote it down. If you want more history told straight and simple, please like this video, leave a comment, and subscribe. Thank you for watching.